Is it possible to do a detailed gouache painting like this using fairly big brushes like this? The answer is yes. My name is James Gurney, and I'm going to show you how to paint this snow pile in front of a supermarket using just 3 large synthetic brushes. Well, I'm in the parking lot of the supermarket again, this time to paint the snow pile behind me. This is the big pile pushed up by the plows recently with a light layer of snow over it. It's backlit so I can see the small textures. And it's melting fast. I won't have too much time to paint this, but I want to dive in. I'm going to start by setting up my easel and the sunshade, and then I'll work on drawing it in with a water-soluble colored pencil. With a subject like this, you don't have to be exact and accurate, but I try to be anyway. So I take a few measurements as I draw the top of the building, the contour of the snow piles, and the shadow line from light to shade. I'm also concerned to get the perspective right, and that means drawing the vanishing point for these parking lot lines. Now I want to pick out 3 colors from the little box of gouache paints that I bring with me. I don't need a bright yellow green, it's not spring yet. Don't need a bright cool red, or even a strong yellow. I can get along with just some white gouache and some yellow ochre for a dull yellow, ultramarine blue, and terra rosa, which is a dull red. This brush set I'm using is made by Richardson, and it comes in a folding holder that fits over your sketchbook. And I keep changing out the brushes actually, but generally I have the big flats in the middle, a smaller flat, and a couple of rounds on the side, getting smaller as you go out. But I mainly use the ones in the center, which are the biggest brushes, but they're all synthetic, so you can use them for gouache or casein. Once I have that more or less the way I want it, I can lay in some washes and put in the shadows wet into wet. You can see them dissolving in the wet washes. Let's wet the parking lot and dissolve some washes into that. And even the foliage up here is onto a pre-wet surface, so these little dots are going to dissolve. Here I'm using just the corner of the brush, so I can get even very small spots with this big brush. Now I can come back later when this is dry and put in some crisper foliage if I want to. But while I have this gray color on the brush, I can define that shadow edge and some of the darks in the snow. I mix some terra rosa and blue to get my darker darks there. This is still my big flat brush, but I'm only using 3 brushes for this whole painting. This is a 3/4 inch brush, synthetic flat. This is a number 12 synthetic flat, and this is a number 8 round. This last one is from a set of travel brushes made by Jack Richardson, and these other 2 are from a no-name craft store, from a set that I got for really cheap, and I sawed them down so they'd fit into the holder. And those are really the only brushes I need for this painting. Well, the pavement is pretty light value, and so I'm going over it with some white gouache to kind of lighten it up and warm it up a little bit, but dry brush across it to get some interesting texture. So I've got a pretty good first pass on this. I've established the shadow side, and now I can really go in and start defining those delicate small forms near the top of the pile. And I'm using that round brush. It's a pretty big round brush, and I squeeze it to make it more of a chisel tip. Now that's what I love doing, is this detailed edge and the forms in raking light. By angling that brush, loading it up with plenty of thick paint, a little bit of yellow ochre to warm up the color, I can get the bright lines of paint following the guidelines to that vanishing point I did earlier. And that's also the driveway on the far side. This is with transparent gouache. These brushes work fine for stipple textures too, especially when the brush gets older. A synthetic brush like this, you can get this rough texture of the pavement by just using the end of the brush and kind of stabbing at the surface. If I brush it too much, it'll pick up the other layers. What I'm going for is a kind of randomized texture. Want the brush to be fairly dry for this. Inside that puddle are some of the tiniest little dots that you can possibly get, but I can get them with this brush. What I'm after really is a sense of randomness. Big brushes are great for that, and old brushes are good for that too. Let me show you a little exercise to wrap up with. This is something you can do yourself. Get a brush, 3/4 inch or an inch flat. It should be able to hold a good edge. And then mix the blue and the either burnt sienna or terra rosa. And then paint kind of a parallelogram. Okay, and what we're going to paint is kind of a checkerboard box. So we paint the other side of the parallelogram. And the idea here is to use the edge of the brush with one touch to draw the lines of the checkerboard. Now we're going this way in perspective. And then using the corner of the brush, let's fill in those boxes as best we can. A shape that's a lot smaller than the size of the brush. But because we're using a big tool, we can do it quickly. And you might need strokes like this in a given painting. You might also want thin strokes, and that's where a flat brush can give those to you. Now once the paint starts to dry on the brush, you can drag it for dry brush strokes. Or you can get a very wet stroke and lay down a dark tone. There's probably something resisting the paint there inside that area, probably some kneaded eraser area that is resisting it. And when you lay a stroke into a wet surface, it blends like that. Now I've let it dry, and let's try painting in the white squares of the checkerboard box over dry paint. Has to be bone dry for this. Now the middle one. Now let's mix in a little bit of the reddish brown paint, but keep it only on one side of the brush. And we can do a blend, all in a single stroke. So let's just do a stroke around the outside of our box. It's going to be light on one side, kind of reddish brown on the other. But you can go over this dark stroke and putting a gradated touch. Maybe there's blades of grasses you want to do. Or let's try dragging a stroke using white and yellow ochre. And I've had strokes like this in this painting. Really get the paint thick and get it right on the tip there. You want a lot of paint. You can drag it and get that kind of dry brush effect over the darker paint. So when you look at a scene, you're analyzing it to see how you might want to use strokes like this to try to simulate the effects in nature. So let's put some final touches on here. Like this sign that's behind the snow pile. And that's about it. So here's the final painting. You can see this is just a very, very tiny area, less than an inch square, out of a whole painting that's only 5 by 8 inches. And it's all done with these 3 brushes. I got links in the bio for tutorials and supplies. Okay, thanks for watching. You might want to check out my website or subscribe to my channel. And then here's a playlist with more good stuff and a video that continues the story. So check them out and share with your friends.